Okay, hello, welcome to the Mid-Career Mentoring Program and to today's topic, expanding your skill set, teaching mid-career writers new tricks because saying that thing about old dogs is insulting to both humans and dogs. So, my name is Bethany Brookshire, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a freelance science journalist and I will be moderating today's Q&A. Tragically, Rodrigo cannot join us today, but he and his plant wall are with us in spirit. I'd like to have today's mentors introduce themselves and give us a little background about their career. And I was wondering if they could also tell us the latest thing they did when they expanded their skill set. So if we could start with Tien, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here with y'all. My name is Bing Nguyen, and I'm a freelance science journalist and video producer. I got my start as a scientist, so I did a chemistry PhD, and about midway through, I realized that research wasn't for me and started looking around for sort of other options. And I'm really happy to see Carmen here today, one of my first mentors, who showed me, what science journalism was. And so right after grad school, I got my start as an Open Notebook Fellow, and so cool to see Siri here too, just, people who really welcomed me to the field. So I started as an Open Notebook Fellow and a writer at Princeton University. So I did that for a few years and really enjoyed helping the students, but then wanted to expand more towards journalism. So I started freelancing on the side. And after a few years of that, basically the election happened and I decided to switch over to full-time journalism. And I had a staff job at Chemical and Engineering News for a couple of years. And they were totally lovely. And I learned so much in the newsroom. But after a couple of years, I realized I had, more interest beyond just chemistry. And I wanted to cover biology and space and do more multimedia. So after a couple of years, I quit and went full-time freelance. And I was freelance for a couple of years, making videos, writing features, news, and then the pandemic hit. And I decided that I wanted to pursue screenwriting. So I moved to LA and decided to go off on this new path. And it's sort of, in the last year, I've realized that it's kind of brought me back to science journalism. I've sort of fallen back in love with science. And now I am producing a show for PBS called Historian's Take, totally not in science. So that is the last time I've expanded my skill set. It's sort of a really intense learning curve, going from a freelancer who is, making my own videos to producing a show where we have a crew and, figuring out how to find locations and film and work with a cinematographer and editor and animator. And so I'm learning all of these skills at once. What did I do to learn them? I kind of just jumped into the deep end. But very luckily, I have a collaborator who's a good friend of mine too, who is the director and showrunner. So she's really kind of held my hand through learning all of these skills. And I will throw it over to Priyanka.
Thanks, Tien. My journey is not very different from Tien's in the sense that I also have a background in science. My background is in ecology, and I realized that I was not just interested in one very niche area of science, but a lot of other aspects of science interested me. So to introduce myself, I'm Priyanka. I'm a science writer at National Geographic, and I cover COVID-19 and health. I'm from India, but currently based in New York. And I'll just say that while this is a mid-career mentoring session, I consider myself at the cusp of early to mid-career. And while I do have things to say, I'm here to learn from everyone. So I mostly covered, I graduated from the UC Santa Cruz Science Journalism program in 2019. And I mostly covered the animals and environment beat as a freelancer until until the pandemic hit. And it was becoming more and more clear that people of color were disproportionately affected and impacted by COVID here in the US. And I couldn't see myself sitting back and not cover such an important and disruptive time in our lives. As much as I never and absolutely never wanted to cover health, the pandemic really changed that. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. For me, it was grasping a whole new field of science from microbiology, immunology, drug development, along with covering stories that have a very, very strong human narrative. And this pushed me to sort of expand my skill set to pursue a whole new beat, but also grow as a reporter and adapt my interviewing skills where I wasn't just talking to scientists, but everyday people who are in pain, who are feeling helpless and not being heard, people who've had terrible healthcare experiences, as well as people who don't believe in science. And so for me, a lot of that has been, my growth in terms of expanding my skill set in more recent times.
Thank you so much. And I also just wanted to note, thank you so much to Siri Carpenter, who is here today playing the role of Rodrigo, which is to say that she is monitoring the chat for all y'all's questions. And so as questions come up, please do go ahead and put them in the chat with question next to them. Siri will monitor the chat and make sure that I get your question. If you have a question for the non-recorded portion, hang on to that until the recording is off. Also note, we are talking about expanding skill sets, but if people want to expand specifically into editing, we have a seminar for that. At least the entire last session will be writer to editor. So hold your editing questions, I would say. But yeah, I wanted to start out. So Tian, one of the big questions that I kind of saw come up in the Slack and that I've been thinking about, how do you know in which way you should expand your skill set? I was really struck when we talked about your career trajectory, like you literally just picked up and moved to LA. Like, I'm out, I'm going. How do you shape a career trajectory and decide in which way you're going to grow?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this question, and I mean, my first instinct is to say that you never really know. You really can just choose. But there are some signs when of like feeling like you are going in the right direction. And I've been going through this the past like probably 6 months of trying to figure out whether I should go back towards science journalism or more towards covering culture and history, which is what I'm working on now. And I'll say that I was convinced I was going a certain way, and having to talk to a lot of friends and sort of get reassurance that I was doing the right thing. I was constantly asking everyone, like, do you think this is a good idea? And in the last like month, I've kind of realized that I do want to go back to science journalism, and maybe just in a different way. And I have this feeling of like, I don't need to ask anyone, because it feels like this is definitely what I want to do. And it took months. It took probably like 6 months of like being on the fence. And, after I sort of realized that, I had people close to me tell me like, yeah, we could have told you that, like, because you were constantly asking us for like, is this right? But I would say that in terms of, I think the other question there was like, how do you shape a career? And I really haven't shaped it. It's like careers are just something you like look back and make up a story on that, you did that. But I think for me, it's just been really being in touch with when you're bored of something, and when you feel like, or you see sort of the end of the road with a certain path. Like I kind of saw that with print journalism, where I could see that the next step would be to write for say more prestigious outlets, and that just didn't excite me. And so when you can sort of see a few steps ahead of like maybe your friends or people around you going down that path, and if it doesn't excite you, I think that's when I start to look like, oh, maybe I should be looking at something else then.
I'm actually reminded of, I had met her, but I was at an event with Virginia Hughes right before she shifted from being a writer to being an editor at BuzzFeed. So it was a while ago. And I remember asking her, like, wow, that's a really big shift. Like, why did you do that? That's kind of huge. And she said, I wasn't afraid anymore.
Mm.
She said one of the things that really got her up in the morning was fear. And the whole, like, am I afraid and excited to be doing what I'm doing?
Mm.
And she realized she wasn't feeling the thrill of like the edge anymore.
Yes.
And she needed to do something different. And I think it sounds a bit like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of putting it. I kind of have that where as soon as I learn how to do something, I'm like, okay, what's next? Like if it's not scary, if I don't know how to do it, then I'm not super motivated to do it.
So I wanted to ask Priyanka, you've done several different types of journalism in your career. And I was wondering, how do you seek out or get people to give you the opportunity to try new things? And I was thinking about that because on staff, people can be like kind of protective of their roles. They're like little dragons with job boards. And for freelancers, if it's something outside of what they've done before, editors may like look for someone who's already done, say, data journalism rather than going to you. So like, how do you go finding the opportunities to kind of get that new experience and expand your skills?
Yeah, it is quite challenging as a freelancer. I remember when I was sort of I knew I wanted to do more data journalism. I learned to do some of it in grad school, and I had some background in analyzing data and making graphics as a scientist in former life. But to actually use that in journalism, the way that sort of worked for me was getting your foot in the door and then starting to ask for opportunities. So working with people that one of the clients that I was working with, they hired me to do something else, do reporting for a story about climate change and wildlife and birds. But that project wasn't quite working out, and I knew just working with them for a little bit that they did have some data journalism opportunities, and I just said, hey, this is something I can do. I haven't done too much of it before, but how about we give it a shot? And would you feel comfortable doing that? So it's more sort of saying, I'm interested in this. These are the skills I have. I may not be great at it, but I can still try. And if you have a project in mind, why don't we give it a try? And that did sort of work out, and I started doing more and more projects for them. And it was basically that the reason to, it was this want to flex more of your muscles. And while I was doing my writing and reporting, I wanted to do some other things as well. And so data journalism was, for me at the time, a great idea, but basically it was showing up and saying, hey, I'm interested in this. I want to do some more of it. Would you mind sort of throwing something at me that is not super high risk, slightly low key? Let me see if I can do it. And if it works out, I would start taking up more ambitious stuff. And at some point where you do want to start doing more ambitious stuff, I think you have to own it and say, hey, I would initially say I dabble in data journalism. I think I still do dabble in data journalism, but I would have to say that I'm a data reporter. And, I would say I'm an early career data reporter, but you have to sort of own it to get other people to take you seriously. So there was a learning curve for that as well.
I actually wanted to follow up on that because I know one of the things I worry about personally expanding skills and taking on new things is failure. Because when I was just starting out as like, a baby science journalist, like it was kind of expected that I would fail. Of course, you're going to fail and everyone's going to be disappointed. And then there will be a lot of tears and then you will come back. But now I feel like I've come into my powers and it's kind of assumed that I will succeed. Failures feel bigger now, and like they kind of reflect on me personally. So how do you kind of deal with the risk and also the reality of failure as opposed to failing in your early career?
I'm I'm not sure if I know the answer to it, but I can sort of um, help explain what my fears have been as an early career journalist to what it's like now. Starting on, it was more, am I doing a good job? If I don't do a good job, or if I fail to deliver, I may not get my next assignment. That editor may not want to work with me again. Now that I've been doing it for some time, it's more expected of me to know how to do things, generally perform more consistently. And the fear of failing is a lot to do with being competent. If not being, then at least looking competent and confident, which many of the times I'm not. So I still I don't know how to navigate that still. If people have had success in doing that, I'd like to hear more, but that's kind of how my fear of failure has shifted over time.
Tian, do you want to add anything about failure?
Only in that I share it. I've had a deep fear of failure as well, and it's something that I've come up against with screenwriting, because I'm starting over, really at the beginning because I've never really written fiction before this, but I'm telling myself that I'm expecting to be bad. Like that's sort of the expectation. I mean, I'm not gonna, but I've run up against blocks where, for this thing I was mentioning about like the past 6 months, like I was thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't do screenwriting. And I realized it was just fear. This fear was sort of like reasoning myself out of it. I'm like, maybe I actually don't like it that much. And, I think it's going to be, whether or not screenwriting pans out as a career move, I don't know. But I know that personally, it's going to be really powerful if I can get over this fear of being bad at something. That's going to be worth it. So we'll see how it goes.
Just one quick thing to add. In recent times, I think I've gotten better at sort of telling my editors that, hey, I'm still trying to figure out how to do this. Although you expect me to know how to do this, I'm still new to this. This is the first time I'm trying to do a project of this scale. So, give me some advice if you can. I'd greatly appreciate it, but I'm more forthcoming with my limitations, with that constant fear of looking incompetent in the background. But I'm getting better at saying that, hey, I don't know how to do this well, or I've struggled with this, but I don't know how it's perceived.
I know I've actually had some luck taking on new hobbies, especially hobbies at which I am deliberately extremely bad. Like I recently have started hobbies that I'm real bad. This is not my thing. And I'm doing it anyway because I love it anyway. And it teaches you to kind of embrace the joy of failure a little in a much more low stakes environment. But I also wanted to ask Tien this. I wanted to approach the concept of expanding skill sets from the other side. Here we are talking about expanding skill sets. Are we obligated to expand them? Are we obligated to learn TikTok and Mastodon and podcast editing? And I mentioned this because you brought up when we were preparing for this seminar that we live in this cult of productivity. And I thought that was really powerful. And I was wondering, is there a balance between expanding skill sets out of desire to do new things and expanding them out of a creeping fear of irrelevance?
Mm. Yeah, when you asked this question, I was like, a hard no. No one needs to expand their skill sets if they don't want to. I feel like, because I remember so acutely wanting to prove myself and feeling all of these shoulds at the beginning of my career, just like doing things because other people thought, that's like the way you should progress. And that's really, I think the pandemic has kind of clarified that for me too. It's like, that's not really a way I want to operate. And, when I've gone after skill sets that, just because I'm interested in them, I feel like that's when it's panned out the best. Instead of like trying to expand into something just because I imagine that other people want me to. And I think that no one actually cares about your career except for you. And I think it's we imagine that there's like this panel of people like judging our career path, but literally no one cares until you tell it to other people, and it's like it becomes clear to me like, oh, I care so much about this, and they'll never think about it again.
So we actually have a follow-up question on confidence, failure, and skill sets. And I think this is actually a question that I'd originally written myself and then sent to Priyanka. How do you know that you are confident enough to apply your new skill and advertise that you can take related work? Is there some scale? Because I often learn quite a lot, but I am not sure how much of an expert I am. I feel this very strongly.
I don't know if there's enough, if there is a certain point in time that for sure. I was telling Bethany when we were on an earlier conversation that it took me so long to say that, even my email signature, to say I'm a science journalist. But I think for me, when I started doing dabbling in data journalism, when I had a few things published, I think that's where I sort of started feeling like I have something to show. And I feel okay saying I'm a data reporter and that I'm asking for more work. I knew I wanted to do more, and so I had to find a way to do it. And I think for me, having a few stories published, something that I felt confident that I could do, and there was something demonstrable for it. That's where I felt like, okay, I'm feeling okay, sort of saying a little more confidently that I can do this.
So that actually leads a little bit into a question that we have specifically for Tien. How did you get into new fields without prior job experience? So, Priyanka was saying, yeah, I feel okay saying that I did journalism, because I had journalism, which is, true. But how do you get into those new areas without any experience?
Yeah, actually, the example comes to mind with video because I feel like I've been picking up the skills for video along the way before I was doing it professionally. So I had an interest in grad school, and I would enter these like video contests, like explain your science for grad students, which is like the lowest bar, like anyone can do it. People were making stuff on like iMovie. So that was like just the lowest. I always look for like the lowest stakes way of like learning the skill. And so I entered these contests, and then I started writing for TED Ed, which is this animated series that are like science explainers. But really anybody can pitch them. It turns out that like they just take pitches from educators mainly, not science writers. So at that point, I was very early career. I think just graduated. And so I pitched them a story. And so I got to work with them, and they edited. I could see how they would edit me. So it's my first time writing a script, but I think they barely paid anything at all. But so now I started to just have a slightly bit more of this skill, right? Script writing. And then it wasn't until I got to my staff job at CNN where they were really open to letting me learn, and they had people who had multimedia skills. And I asked them to show me how to use Premiere. But even before that, I was watching a lot of videos on like lynda.com and just YouTube videos, because it turns out all of the video editors I'd asked, everyone told me they just learned on YouTube. And so I realized like, okay, that's a way that you can actually get to a point of like getting hired to do that. So by the time that I was a freelancer and pitching a video to an outlet and saying like, I'm gonna report, write, narrate, edit myself, it was like years of kind of learning it on the side. So I don't like it might seem like I'm suddenly jumping into a new field, but I've been kind of slowly picking up those skills like along the way.
That sounds very sneaky. You're like stealth, grabbing new skill, grabbing new skill. So we have another question for you. It says, for Tien, I'm in science comms at Princeton. Hi. And considering a shift towards science journalism, how did you navigate the conflicts? Doesn't my institutional affiliation taint me as a freelancer in the eyes of the mainstream outlets? How did you build those related but slightly different skills as a reporter versus a PIO?
Yeah, it was definitely a concern because I think that some outlets, conflict of interest varies so much by outlet. And I remember at this point, an editor at CNN actually, while I was still at Princeton, they let me know like, as long as it's not in the field that you're covering, we're open to it, particularly for them because of course they're a chemistry magazine and that was my background. So they were open to sort of cultivating younger talent at that point. So I think as long as you talk to the editor about it, you can still write for places. I think when I was transitioning, I was starting to, I think I wrote something for Mental Floss that was not in chemistry though, because I was writing about chemistry for Princeton. So the editor was cool with that. Wrote something for New Scientists. And so I think actually people were open to it as long as I told them, you know, what the conflict of interest was. And so that also, I was at Princeton for 3 years. So I was probably doing maybe like a few freelance pieces a year, which was a great way to like slowly learn those skills and also not feel the pressure of having like to pay my bills with freelance and, you know, take my time with these articles. So it really, I did that over a few years. And then towards the end, right when the election happened, I was like, okay, it's time to ramp it up. And then I started intentionally pitching a lot more and also asking my Princeton job if they'd let me go down to 50% so that I could make this transition. And I had a great boss who kind of knew that I wasn't going to stay in that position forever. So she was really great at, you know, letting me kind of slowly move into journalism.
So speaking of kind of moving into kind of new things, I have another question for Priyanka. Many of us have started out, you know, in our early career, we were very much in smaller projects, single study articles, single study press releases, and now we're in mid-career and we want to pursue bigger, longer term projects. And as freelancers, those projects can be both very high risk and very high reward. You know, you do a lot of like pre-reporting for something, then nobody takes it and you never got paid for hours and hours of whatever you did. And I was wondering if you could talk about big projects and how you manage risk associated with those both, and the differences between managing a transition to big projects as a freelancer and managing one as a staffer, because I know you've done both freelance and staff for that.
Yeah, I think it's super challenging as a freelancer. Like you said, you know, you could spend hours and hours thinking a story will work, and then, you know, do all the pre-reporting and try and pitch things, and maybe it's just nothing comes out of it. Not to say that, you know, at some point there will be a hook for it and it will be useful at some later point, but you know, that's not necessarily to say that it's going to help you pay that month's rent or the next month's rent. So I think one thing that I sort of started doing as a freelancer, trying to do more features and a little more ambitious projects, is with the editors that I had worked with, I would just say, hey, I'm looking into something to this effect. And would you mind having 5 minutes to get on the phone with me? And, you know, could we chat a little bit about this? Is this something that interests you? that is again at a point where we have a little bit of an established relationship, and I've done a few stories for them, whether it's a single study story or there are feature assignments that they gave me, and they had confidence that I could write a feature or I could tackle a topic that's a little bit more controversial. So with that trust building over time, I've sort of navigated into doing slightly more risky projects. But before I invest way too much time into it, I do some pre-reporting. It's not like I don't, and that's with the risk that nothing may ever come out of it. But I think that initial sort of conversation for me has been helpful into deciding whether I want to invest too much time into it, at least with a certain outlet or a certain editor, or go somewhere else. And also, fine tune the pitch a bit more when I actually have to get that pitch to the editor. So for me, that's generally proved helpful.
So I also wanted to go back to something that Tien mentioned. Yes, that you did. You actually, when you started doing more freelancing, you went down to half-time at Princeton. And I was wondering if we could talk about how to expand our skill sets without completely breaking our work-life balance. Because as a scientist, when I was a scientist, I learned science writing as a blogger by writing at night, and I had no life. I I did nothing. And now I am old and I am tired. And I ended up actually waiting to learn to write a book to get a fellowship so that I could sleep. And I was wondering if you had advice for people who may not be able to do a fellowship, but still want to expand their skills, pay their rent, and not, burn out or be drinking mugs of coffee the size of their head at 3:30 in the afternoon.
I think it's really hard. And I was in such a similar position in grad school of blogging and, trying to build up clips and just not sleeping. And I often, I wrote a blog post about my path, and I made sure to include a point about my first year into Princeton that I burned out really hard. And it took me a very long time to recover from that. And I say that as it sounds great, to be able to jump from thing to thing to thing, but there is a cost to it. And I feel like sometimes we don't talk about that. It's just oh, this thing happened for me. It's well, I kind of paid for it a bit too. But now I see it as I just kind of try to extend how long I think it'll take me to learn something. So with screenwriting, I've just tried to be more realistic. I think it's going to take 3 to 5 years to get to a point where I'm writing things that I'm proud of. And I could kill myself and do that in a year or two, and just be writing all the time and not sleeping and not having a social life. But that's not the life I want. And I think that one good thing about kind of switching paths so many times is realizing that I don't feel as much that I have to prove anything. And if it's, I think that the pandemic helped me see that, nothing really matters. So why should I care about proving anything to anybody? And that's something that, plagued me a lot in my younger years. But now maybe the pandemic has turned me a bit more into a nihilist, that nothing matters. So why should I spend my precious time worrying?
Yeah, that's definitely, I also tell myself sometimes look, the time has passed. You are never going to make the 30 under 30 list for anything ever again. That is gone. So you might as well improve on your own good time.
Yes.
Because those time lists are off limits to you. So we have another question from the audience. This is not exactly about expanding your skill set, but rather about maintaining it. At different stages of my career, I've found myself utilizing different sets of skills. The question is, how do you keep from losing or forgetting the skills that you aren't using right now? Any tips, especially since not everything is like riding a bicycle. Sometimes the process of learning has to start all over again if you've been away too long. I feel this. especially with regard to coding. Boy, have I forgotten more code than I've ever written.
I can say I had one such experience. I mean, it's going to sound so naive and so silly, but I recently I've taken on a slightly bigger scale project in recent times, and I haven't field reported for 2 years or almost 2 years. But I was back on the field 2 weeks ago, and I realized my sort of local newspaper sort of style of field reporting skills were absolutely rusty. And I think 3 days I was just beating myself up about how, you know, I should have just walked into like certain clinics and asked people to chat with me. I should have approached certain things a certain way, but I think you have to go back to making some mistakes, I guess, and let yourself feel rusty before you sort of start again. And you may not be that great at it as you were, but I think you still retain so much of what you were able to do with a certain skill set back in the days, and when you try and like sort of revive it. But again, there is you have to give yourself, or at least that's what I told myself, you have to give yourself some time to let yourself feel rusty and not so good about it, and be okay with it, and pick it up yet again. I know that's my take.
Self-compassion is never a wrong answer, I think. So Tien, we've had a lot of requests about how to expand skill sets into multimedia journalism, most particularly video. And so I was wondering what skills you found that you brought into video when you first started out. And also, what resources did you start with to try and kind of like learn? You mentioned YouTube, so that's huge. But were there other resources that you took advantage of?
Yeah, I also watched a lot of lynda.com videos about how to edit. But in terms of learning video, I think a lot of it comes from watching videos. And that's something that anyone can do. I think like the technical skills, you actually don't need that many in order to like make a short video, let's say with footage from a researcher. And I actually taught a course with Helen Thompson last year during the pandemic. And it was, I believe it should be on NASW's web to members now, because it was for DUXWA, DC science writers. And we had, it was like a 3-part course where the first part I taught script writing, and then Helen taught editing. And the third one, everyone made their own videos. People who had never made videos before had made a 3-minute video, and they were great. And we had a couple of guests come in and give feedback. So I've found that the technical skills are actually the easiest part. The harder part is learning to write to visuals. And that's just having a sense of story and what will be captivating on screen. And so for that, I'd recommend watching a bunch of videos, looking at sort of tracing their structure and seeing how it's different from the structure of like a print story. Because there's a lot of things that you just can't write a story as if you wrote it for print and then suddenly just find images to pair with it. Because in video, the image, what you're saying, the music, all of it is working together, and it's a constant sort of constant dance to figure out how much information people can take in, because you're giving them so much. So I'd say starting with just watching the different types of videos, reading the scripts as you're seeing what's on screen, because there will be things like you write sentences like, this is a blank. 90% of science videos start with the word this is a blah, 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 which you would never do in print. So that like, and sort of doing your own research and reporting of like, oh, I'm seeing that all these videos start with this. All the videos have at some point some sort of B-roll shot where they show like outside of a scientific institution, just like doing your own sort of investigation into what makes a good science video. I feel like I kind of lost the original question, but what skills did I bring into it? I mean, reporting is very similar. I mean, it's not so different. It's just for video, making sure that you have sort of tight sound bites. That's very different. I mean, I know we're looking for great quotes in print too, like anything that conveys emotion or surprise. But in video, we have such a low tolerance for listening to people talk. Actually, it's even if they're the most eloquent speaker, if they don't say it within 2 to 3 sentences, it's too long. And you're not going to have, unless you have an incredible budget, you're not going to have enough images to show behind what they're saying. So simplifying it as much as possible and then putting it in your own words. I think that's sort of unique to video. Let me know if I forget what the original question was.
No, I think you really got to it. And it actually reminds me a lot of kind of, as I've gotten more into my career, the way I read other people's journalism. Like, I don't know about all y'all, but I cannot just read a science story and enjoy it. I can't. Every time I read, I'm like, oh, okay, there's the nut graph. Yep. Oh, look, they're doing a braid. That's cute. Oh, this one's going to be a whale. Like, I dissect the narrative structure and I'm like, oh, and you're going to bring in this guy. Yep, there it is. So, I mean, like, I feel like if you get to that point in watching videos as well, where you can kind of pull apart the structure and like be like, I see what you did there. That's kind of a good start. But I actually wanted to, at this point, bring in 2 of our previous mentors. Thank you so much to Lila Guterman and Shannon Paulus, who have agreed to come back because we had a couple of questions in the Slack about management. A lot of mid-career expansion involves managing other people. And I was wondering if Lila and Shannon would be willing to talk about how did you go about when you first were put in charge of a bunch of direct reports, and you're stuck with the phrase direct report. How do you go about improving the skills needed for management, and what kind of skills are those?
Shannon, do you want to go first, or shall I?
I can go first. I will say that I am just a baby manager. I manage interns, and I started doing that after I got promoted to senior editor, and I've been working with a lot of writers, including some regular writers, and I basically just put it out there that I would like a writer who's consistently mine and reports to me, and someone left, and they had been managing the interns before, and so I got left managing the interns. And in terms of building the skills to manage, I think that it was definitely something that I did on the fly. I've heard that some media organizations have management training programs, and that's awesome. I'm jealous of them. What I really made sure to do was that I was talking to my mentors at work and my outside support systems about what to do. So it wasn't just me and the intern in this manager-managee relationship. It was me and the intern and my advisors. So I consider myself an empathetic person. I had worked for a while as an editor. I had my own bag of tricks in terms of setting deadlines and being flexible and offering grace when there was something big going on in the world. But I really counted on people around me to answer the questions that I had about the process. So I sort of felt like I had a little board of advisors working with me. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear what Lila has to say, though.
I'm not sure I have any sort of deep thoughts. I guess I've been a manager for about 12 years, so it's been some time. I have, in every case, been doing this in the context of small to large organization with a full-time job. So I was lucky in some of my earlier positions to actually get to do some management training. Some of it is a complete waste of time. I mean, you just sit there thinking, like, why is my organization paying these people, and how is this possibly a good use of my time? And others have been really sort of eye-opening and helpful. I will recommend to everyone this organization called, it has the very generic name, the Management Center. Their thing is like training managers who work for nonprofits. So, you know, even if you work for a for-profit place, I still highly recommend them. They have a book, so if you don't have it in your budget to, you know, do a training program, their book has the very exciting title of Managing to Change the World. But despite that all-encompassing thing, it actually has a lot of sort of really practical suggestions. And I know at an NISW session some years ago, Catherine Brown mentioned this book too, and I hear that she's just a fantastic boss. She works at HHMI, for those of you who don't know her. So yeah, I would recommend their book, their training. I've done a couple of different of their training programs, and they were both really good. And then, you know, I feel like by virtue of, in my first job, which was also at CNEN, although Tian and I did not overlap, my first management training job, I mean, my first job as a manager, I have not had that, you know, cup of coffee as big as my head. Bethany Scatters. I only had one direct report, but I was working with a ton of different freelancers. And just working with freelancers gives you sort of, it has sort of all of the pluses and some of the minuses, you know, of ways you can mess up. Yeah, because they can stop working with you at any time. And you similarly, if they just don't meet what you need, you also can stop working with them. But I also have just been really lucky over the course of, you know, the 4 or so different jobs I've had where I've had direct reports, that with one exception, everyone has been really hardworking, smart, and good at their job, you know. So I would say what Shannon said about having sort of an informal panel of advisors really rings true to me. You know, it can be within the place you work, or, you know, your friends. Yeah, I mean, with this one direct report I had at who is not in this group, and probably no one here knows them, it was a really troubled relationship, and it was really hard. I mean, it's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, is sort of work with this one person. So you know, it's experiences like that that make me question, like, why am I doing this managing people thing? So anyway, I've sort of babbled here. I'm not sure if any of what I said has been all that useful, except maybe check out Managing to Change the World, this book. I should reread it because it is good.
No, I think that was really helpful. And it also, I think the important thing that I gathered kind of from both of you so far is, like, you're managing people is not managing worker drones, it's managing human beings. And some of those human beings are interns and tiny and babies, and some of them are not. And those people all come with their different pluses and minuses and their different previous relationships with you. And that really shapes how you manage them.
Yes, absolutely.
I also wanted to ask Shannon in particular about giving feedback, because I know, like, as a writer, I am used to having editors give me feedback, and I love it. I love my editors so much, very much. Please save me from myself. But then when I end up on the other side, like there's an urge to try and be funny or sarcastic or snarky, and don't do that. And, you know, so like when you're kind of transitioning into being a manager, how do you kind of develop a feedback style that is both effective and supportive, without, you know, being a meanie person?
That's a great question. I will say first off, speaking of formats, I'm a huge fan of the shit sandwich feedback, both giving and being on the receiving end. I can tell when someone's giving it to me, and you know what? I still feel better. Like, coat it in sugar. Like, and also one of the things I really believe, both as someone who gets feedback and gives feedback, is that pointing out the positive things that someone has done in a piece of work, it's not just a means of sugarcoating it, it's a way to reinforce that as like, this is working, keep doing it. Like, do this in the next draft as well. Keep this thing intact. So one, the value in positive feedback. Two, honestly, one of the most important things I did completely on accident. I took a humor writing class at an organization called Catapult in New York City that was centered around workshopping things as a group. So each week we would write a short humor piece and we would print out enough copies for everyone to have one, or we would email it around or whatever people preferred. And we would have to like give feedback on each other's pieces. And there was a rule that you had to do 3 suggestions and 3 like this was working things. And just having to do that over and over and over on my peers' work and having people do that for me just like really worked that muscle. So I think that like I stole things from the teacher in terms of how I phrase them, and like how I say like, oh, there's an opportunity for like XYZ here. I steal things from other editors all the time. I still write a bunch myself. So like, I'll just try to like keep that going in my brain. Like, I'll notice when someone says something in a way that works, or like just has a process that works a little bit better than mine. I'm always like kind of taking those things to refine my process. But I would say like right off the bat, just get as much practice as you can in an environment that's not your job, if you can. Any sort of workshopping situation will help you get there.
And for those who are not familiar, the crap sandwich or the poop sandwich or the whatever kind of sandwich you want to call it, is basically the poop is in the middle and the bread is on the outside. And the bread is the good part because everybody loves carbs. And so you start with something like, Shannon, that latest piece you wrote was really super funny. And then you get to the poop part. I hated the main point. And then you get to the other part of the sandwich, which was, but I laughed the whole time. So, you know, so knowing what that is. And I will say I have used it myself, and I've also taught other people to use it. And yeah, I mean, I know when it's being used on me, and I still feel soothed as a person. I also wanted to ask Lila one more question. I was wondering how management changed when you had to shift from in-person to remote, because I know a lot of people who are going to be managing now will probably be always managing remote. You know, like many of us are probably never going back to the office.
Yeah, and I mean, half of my direct reports right now are remote. So, you know, like they live far away. It's not just that they're not coming back to the office. It's just even more important to keep the lines of communication open. It can get really hard when you have 11,000 things to edit and they're trying really hard to do, you know, a whole slew of reporting, to be like, hey, can we talk for 20 minutes just to check in? But it's really important because otherwise you really don't know sort of what's going on in their life, in their work life. I say this, I mean, I break that rule all the time, but it's really important to keep up the communication and realize, you know, I feel like I should have a Post-it note on my computer that, like, you know, Slack is not the same thing as talking. It's just not as good. and so it is really important to make sure that you're on the same page, or else the person who tends to feel imposter syndrome and feel like they're incompetent is going to be sitting in their own little space thinking, well, she's not calling me about this story because she thinks it sucks. And, the person who thinks that they did an awesome job and there are no holes in their reporting or anything is thinking, well, I can now go to the gym for 3 hours because the story's done, so just like, it's really important to keep the communication going even more when you're not in the same building. That's pretty much I think everything else is pretty much the same. And I mean, Evie brought up a couple of things in the chat that I just really want to reemphasize. I mean, and you all know this from, working with editors or working with bosses and working with direct reports, but it's really important as a manager to come to any interaction, especially the ones that might be difficult, with the belief, the real belief that the other person is doing the best that they can, and is and wants to make things work too. So I think it can be very frustrating, obviously, to when there's conflict or when there's difficult conversations, but to sort of try to see the good in everyone.
Yeah, I have to say, like, as a millennial, I deeply avoid the phone and infinitely prefer text. I respond to phone calls like a cat confronted with a cucumber. I'm just like, ah! But every time I get on the phone, I've never regretted it, ever. Like, once you get on the phone, I think also there's the fact that tone is so difficult on the internet. You don't know somebody's tone of voice, and having the phone call gives you that tone of voice back, and then you can actually hear it in your head when you're reading their commentary, right? And you can realize, oh, they're just being sarcastic here. They didn't mean it. Like, this is not meant to sound as mean as I am hearing it in my head. And I think the phone is really good for that too. Thank you so much, Lila and Shannon. We are now ready for the non-recorded portion of the program. So I am going to stop the recording.